This is Shalom World Podcast.
Uniquely to Hebrews, Jesus is not just the sacrifice, but he's also the priest, the one who offers the sacrifice. Hello and welcome back to Voyage. I'm Richard Ounsworth, speaking to you from Holy Cross Priory, the Dominican Priory in Leicester, and we've been talking about the letter to the Hebrews. Last time we got to the end of chapter 10 and we were told that we are people of faith. It's the fact that we are people of faith that enables us to continue on our journey towards God, our pilgrimage to the heavenly city, to entering into God's rest. What is that faith? That's something that chapter 11 will talk about in a very distinct unit that the whole chapter makes up, which is not exactly a definition, but rather an illustration of faith. It begins like this. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. In the Jewish imagination, there are two realms, the realm which is above, the realm of God, and the realm that is below where we live, the normal world. In the upper realm, in heaven, there are these invisible things that we believe in by our faith. And those invisible things are also the things that are hoped for. Because you see, in the eschatological hopes of the Jewish people, what was expected was that that which was above, these invisible realities, would come down. You see this, for example, at the end of the book of the Apocalypse, when Jerusalem, the heavenly city, descends from heaven to earth. There is this idea that at one and the same time, we are making our pilgrimage upwards to God, and at the same time, in the fullness of time, those things which are above would descend to earth. Therefore, to believe in invisible things is the same thing as to look forward in hope to the things that haven't yet come. And faith is more than just thinking that these things exist, believing that these things will happen. It's an attitude of trust in God which gives testimony to the reality of these things. Those words, assurance and conviction, aren't just stuff that's going on in our heads. They are concrete proof, objective evidence of the reality of these unseen things. Hebrews is going to go on to list a number of characters from the Old Testament, especially from the book of Genesis, characters who possess this attitude of faith, which testifies to the reality of those invisible and hoped-for things. We begin with Abel. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain's. Through this, he received approval as righteous. Unusually, I won't read every single word of the chapter, and I think that's because it is deliberately quite repetitive, and I'll talk more about that deliberate repetition in a moment. We move on from Abel to Enoch. By faith, Enoch was taken so that he did not experience death. He was not found because God had taken him. Enoch was the grandfather, if memory serves, of Noah. And that line we've just heard, he was not because God has taken him, is from the book of Genesis. It's always been believed by the Jewish people that Enoch never died. When it says God took him, it means that he was assumed into heaven. In some of the apocalyptic Jewish books that didn't make it into the Bible, Enoch figures as quite an important character. In the book of Enoch, he becomes somebody called Metatron, which is the voice of God. It's all quite extraordinary stuff, and we're not bound to believe it, but we are bound to believe that Enoch is a good example of one who has faith. The next example is Noah. By faith, Noah, warned by God about events as yet unseen, respected the warning and built an ark to save his household. By faith, the next verse begins, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith he stayed for a long time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. Before we go on, I hope you've already noticed that we have a series of sentences that all begin with the same phrase, by faith. Over and over again, it says by faith, and then it mentions a person who has that characteristic, that attitude, who bears that evidence for the existence of these unseen realities. And Hebrews is deliberately doing this, using this repetition to build up a pattern. It has a rhetorical effect, a powerful rhetorical effect of building a cumulative argument. But as we'll see later in the chapter, when he breaks that pattern, that's also deliberate to create a new section and perhaps to introduce a new idea, perhaps even to surprise us. More on that shortly. The next thing I want to point out is that there's much more about Abraham than there has been about Abel and Enoch and Noah. And that's deliberate. Abraham features far more than any other character in this chapter 11. And that's because Abraham is a perfect example of what Hebrews means by faith. And it's particularly in regards to the fact that he was a nomad, that he was wandering somewhere. He moved around. And did you notice that he says this? He set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. That's a reference to the promises which have been such an important part of Hebrews' argument. God's promises to Abraham are precisely the promises that are being fulfilled now by Jesus, especially through his death and entrance into heaven. So Abraham was promised an inheritance. What was that inheritance? Above all, it was the land, the promised land, to which Hebrews has already strongly suggested we are making a pilgrimage. Except, of course, our land, our promised land, isn't the land of Canaan, it's heaven itself. But in fact, he now implies very heavily that that was true in a way for Abraham also. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, so he's in Canaan, as in a foreign land, living in tents. The implication is, if Abraham had thought that the land of Canaan, the promised land, was all there was to God's promises, he would have stopped living in tents and built himself a house. The fact that he still lives as a nomad, even when he's in the land of Canaan, proves that the land of Canaan isn't the ultimate reality of the promised land that God has promised to his people. That applies to Abraham. It applies also to his son Isaac and his son Jacob, who've also been mentioned. For he looked forward, he goes on, to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. That's the real promised land, the heavenly city, the Jerusalem which is above. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. By faith, there's that phrase again, he, Abraham, received power of procreation even though he's too old and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised. That is to say, because Abraham believed that God was faithful. Of course, the faithfulness of God isn't exactly the same as our faithfulness. For us, to be faithful means to place our trust in God. For God, to be faithful is to be trustworthy. He is somebody in whom we can indeed place our trust. But it is the faith or faithfulness of God that gives rise to and causes our faith to endure. It's because we know God is faithful that we too can be faithful. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, that is to say, Abraham was really old, descendants were born as many as the stars of heaven and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. That's, again, a quotation from the book of Genesis, and it's, I think, probably to be read as a reference to the church. St. Paul is much more explicit about this, that the real descendants of Abraham are those who his children by faith rather than simply of the flesh. I think the point here, though, is much more that Abraham is so old, he was virtually dead, but God can bring life out of death. It points in a subtle way towards the resurrection. And we Christians are children of the resurrection. St. Paul tells us when we are baptized, we're baptized into Christ's death so that we can also be baptized into his resurrection. What Hebrews has been implying, as I've explained over the last couple of chapters, is that by his death, Christ has transformed what death is to make it to the gateway into life. So by our deaths, because they participate in the death of Christ, we enter into resurrection. By our deaths, we become children of Abraham by faith, the church. Now there's a summary section which doesn't begin with by faith. Instead of the Greek pisdei, by faith, it begins katapistin, in accordance with faith. That change is deliberate because the next paragraph is, as it were, in brackets. It's, if you will, an explanatory note, but it's a very important one. All of the people we've been talking about so far, all of these died in faith, without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. Here now, then, in this explanatory note, this more lengthy explanation of the theological point, Hebrews is much more explicit. If you are a hero of faith from the Old Testament, and indeed if you are a hero of faith now, you are somebody who lives as a pilgrim, a sojourner, a traveller, somebody who recognizes that we have no earthly city, but are making our pilgrimage to the heavenly one. I'm reminded of how St. Peter begins his first letter. He addresses himself to the people of the diaspora. And in one sense, that just means people who don't live in Jerusalem, who are scattered. That's what diaspora means, literally, scattering. But it also implies that every Christian is an exile. Every Christian is an emigrant. Every Christian, we might go so far as to say, is an asylum seeker. But the asylum that we all seek is that heavenly asylum, which is the city which is above. And St. Paul says something similar in the letter to the Philippians. He tells us that our commonwealth or our citizenship is in heaven. We don't belong down here on earth, we belong in heaven. And as long as we are here on earth, we are always exiles making our way to a heavenly city. By faith, we begin with that phrase again now. Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, "It is through Isaac that descendants shall be named after you." He considered the fact that God is able even to raise someone from the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. That brings to a close the Abraham passage, as I said, by far the longest passage in this chapter. And you'll see how it ends with Abraham's belief in the resurrection. When Abraham was told to offer up his son Isaac, he was willing to do so because his faith in God was so strong that he believed that God could bring back Isaac even from the dead. We know, of course, that God in the end did not require Abraham to sacrifice his son. He had been putting Abraham to the test, but he could have done, and Abraham would have been willing. In fact, there's a suggestion that nearly sacrifice of Isaac looks forward to the death of Christ. Isaac, like Joshua, like Abraham himself, like many other characters in the Old Testament, functions as a type of Christ. When Jesus is baptized, he's addressed as God's beloved son. And that echoes the way in which God speaks about Isaac to Abraham in that chapter, I think it's chapter 22 of the book of Genesis. It implies, just subtly, that as Isaac is to Abraham, so Jesus is to God. Except that whereas in the end, God did not require Isaac to be killed, he does allow his own son to be killed. We might go so far as to say that the sacrifice of Isaac was only ever pointing towards the sacrifice of Christ. Now, when Isaac wasn't killed on Mount Moriah, which is often identified with Mount Zion, where the temple was, when Isaac wasn't killed, they sacrificed a ram instead. That was the first animal sacrifice on the mountain where the temple was eventually going to be built. So we can say that all of the animal sacrifices in the temple cult were just placeholders for the sacrifice of Isaac, except not the Isaac who was the son of Abraham, but we might say the true Isaac of God, Jesus Christ himself. And God did indeed have, of course, the power to raise up his own beloved son from death. To believe in God, to have faith in God, is to believe that the power of God and the love of God is so much stronger than death, that death cannot hold on to Jesus Christ, and therefore can't hold on to us either, as I've already said in earlier episodes. We finish with Abraham and we move on. By faith, Isaac invoked blessings for the future on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions about his burial. We then come to the next biggest character in this chapter, which is, perhaps not surprisingly, Moses. Abraham and Moses are the two greatest characters, I think we can safely say, in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth. I think we'd have to say it wasn't Moses who had faith at that point, but his parents. Do you see, though, how the pattern is actually subtly broken down? Up to this point, it's always, by faith, someone did something, and that someone had faith. It's broken down just a tiny bit, but this points forwards to the way in which it's going to break down much more dramatically in a few verses' time, and that's going to be important. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. It's an extraordinary claim that Hebrews makes here, that when Moses allowed himself to be associated with his ethnic colleagues, the people of Israel, rather than his adoptive grandfather, the Pharaoh, he was being persecuted for Christ. The implication is that the faith of Moses was so strong that already he could see that God's promises would be fulfilled in the person of his Messiah. So the implication is that the faith that's been illustrated by all of these characters from the Bible so far is always, at least implicitly, faith in Christ. It's a faith in Christ that looks forwards. For us, faith in Christ is a faith that looks both forwards and backwards, back to the things that Christ has already achieved, but also forwards to the Christ who is to come and to the way in which he will finally bring history to its close and its fulfillment. By faith, he, Moses, left Egypt unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. That must be God. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. We talked a lot about sprinkling of blood, didn't we, a couple of episodes ago? So that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. We move on from Moses. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. That's obviously a reference to the Exodus. What happens next? Surely something to do with the wilderness wanderings. But no, listen. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. Well, that's very puzzling, isn't it? Puzzling, I think, for two reasons, but those two reasons unite to give us a real jolt. Firstly, the fact that we've skipped over not just the wilderness wanderings, but also the crossing of the Jordan and entry into the promised land. Those two things, of course, have already featured implicitly in chapters 3 and 4. And I think the fact that they're missed out here is precisely to draw our attention to the fact that they've been missed out and that they were covered earlier on. That might seem a bit mad. I'm arguing essentially that something is being emphasized by not being said at all. But in fact, this is a common classical rhetorical move. It even has its own name, metalepsis. You don't have to remember that. But what it means is when there's a list and there's something obvious missed out, the speaker or writer is drawing our attention precisely to the gap. So I think this is a deliberate gap. The second thing, of course, is the rhetorical structure, the grammar, if you like, or the syntax, has broken down. I've said already, hitherto, with that tiny exception of Moses when he's a baby, it's always been, by faith, somebody who had faith did a thing. But listen again to this. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. Well, the walls of Jericho couldn't possibly have had faith. That's obviously wrong. So whose faith are we talking about? After they had been encircled for 7 days, it's like we don't even have after somebody had encircled them. By putting it into the passive, there's a deliberate occluding, a deliberate covering up of who is being spoken about, who actually had the faith. And again, I think it's deliberate. Now, of course, all the people of Israel, we know from the book of Joshua, encircled the walls of Jericho. But at whose instruction? Who was their leader? Who was organizing all of this? It was Joshua. Joshua's name has been missed out. And I think just like the missing out of the crossing of the Jordan and entry into the promised land, this is a deliberate missing out another metalepsis. And of course, the two are very closely associated because it was Joshua who led the people through the Jordan and into the promised land. So precisely by missing out Joshua and what he did, Hebrews is in a weird way drawing our attention to Joshua. But why is it doing it in this weird way? If you cast your minds back to the arguments I made when we spoke about chapters 3 and 4, you'll know that I think it's because Hebrews wants to draw our attention to the identity of name between Jesus and Joshua. Remember, the Hebrew Yeshua, Joshua, is translated in Greek in the Old Testament as Jesus, and that's the name that comes to us via the Latin as Jesus. So Jesus is Joshua. We cover up the historical Joshua of the Old Testament precisely to draw attention to the fact that the real Joshua is Jesus. It's really Jesus who's crossed over the Jordan. Not the River Jordan, but something much more powerful, death itself. And remember, of course, Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan before he began his ministry. And baptism for us is entry into Jesus' death and so into his resurrection. So you see how it all joins up. And I think this is quite deliberate. So once again, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had received the spies in peace. It's odd that the very last person who is described by that Greek word piste, by faith, should be Rahab. We've already missed out Joshua, who is surely the most perfect example of faith. It's made explicit, remember, in chapter 3, that Joshua exceeds even Moses in faith, and yet here he is not mentioned. But why Rahab? Rahab, according to St. Matthew, is one of the ancestors of Jesus. So perhaps there's a subtle link to Jesus going on here. But what we're told in particular is that she received the spies in peace. And you'll remember, I spoke about this when we did chapter 3, Joshua and Caleb were two of the 12 spies who were sent into the promised land. In echo of that, Joshua sent 2 spies, 2 because only 2 had been faithful before, presumably. Joshua had sent 2 spies into Jericho. Those spies were hunted down by the soldiers, by the police in Jericho, and they hid in the house of Rahab the prostitute. She hid them, and in return, they promised that she and her family would be spared when everyone else in Jericho, without exception, was put to death by the Israelites when they conquered the city. So there's another connection to Joshua, and there's a connection to Jesus via his genealogy as expressed to us in the Gospel of St. Matthew. He then goes on to completely change the way in which he's been writing. Hitherto, we've had this repeated by faith, by faith, by faith. It's broken down already in a certain way, but now it breaks down much more dramatically. Instead of these long sentences, each introduced by the phrase piste, by faith, we have a series of very short little sentences, not even really proper sentences at all. But it begins like this: "And what more should I say? For time would fail to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets." So instead of long sentences, paragraphs even, about each person, we've just got a list of other people who are presumably also heroes of the faith. And notice he begins by saying, "What more should I say?" Ti etilego, in case you're interested in the Greek. I mention that because you could translate ti etilego quite differently. You could translate it as, why am I still talking? And I think that understanding of it needs to be kept in mind as well. There's an implication that there is nothing more to say. And I want to come back to that in a moment. Let me just read you a little bit more first, though. We've had Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Do you see the rhetorical effect of this series of very, very short phrases? Bang, 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 bang. And in no particular order. Up until this point, it's been a very ordered examination in terms of faith of the history of the people of Israel all the way back to Abel, especially concentrating on Abraham through to Moses and then the conquest of the promised land. Suddenly, that order breaks down. There's no historical order. There's no nice, calm use of Greek, use of language. Instead, it's like being fired at by a machine gun, almost. And so it goes on. Women received their death by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented. Again, this barrage of words that comes at us. And I think it's linked to this expression, why am I still talking? A way of reading the words that also do mean, what more is there to say? Let me explain what I mean here. I think the implication of all of this is that the neat ordering and arrangement of Israel's history came to a stop precisely at the moment of the crossing of the Jordan and entry into the promised land. At that point, things changed somehow. And the effect of this barrage of words, to my mind, it's a bit like when the needle gets stuck in a record. I'm conscious, because I'm an old man now, I'm 51, nearly 52, I'm conscious that not everybody watching this will remember long playing records, so I'm going to explain. You put your record, a disc of plastic with grooves in it, on a turntable which spins, and there's a needle that sits in the grooves, and as the record spins, the needle tracks what turns out to be one long spiral. But sometimes what used to happen, I remember this very vividly, is that the needle would skip. It would keep going back one because there was a little bit of damage in the record. And then the effect was that you would get just a second or two of the music over and over again. We don't make progress anymore. The needle has got stuck. And what you had to do when that happened was, well, you had a choice. If you were sensible, you would carefully pick up the needle and put it down again a little bit further on in the track. If you were incautious, you would just bang the record player on the side, and that would be enough to nudge it along a little bit. What I'm suggesting to you is this, that is precisely what God has done in Christ. The record of Israel's history, the course of the history of salvation, in a certain sense, got stuck at the moment when Israel crossed the Jordan and entered into the promised land. Yes, they conquered the promised land. Yes, they destroyed the city of Jericho. Yes, David became king in Jerusalem, and everything that happened, that did happen, and that is part of salvation history. But there's a way in which that never made progress. We got stuck. And I think that's precisely because when the people of Israel had been invited to enter into the promised land at Kadesh Barnea, they refused. And therefore, remember, cast your minds back to chapters 3 and 4, Therefore, God said, never shall they enter my rest. And he was speaking of another day, remember. So the people of Israel could not enter into God's rest until such time as Christ would come along to lead us into the true promised rest. Christ, who is the real Joshua, would lead us into the real promised land. And it was at that moment when Christ passed through death and into the resurrection, entering into the heavenly halls. It was at that moment that history got back on track, that God nudged the needle just a little tiny bit, and the record began to play once more. So he concludes his long list of heroes of the faith by saying this, "Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, just as I've said, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, without us, be made perfect." The history of salvation, the true fulfillment of God's promises to the people of Israel, could not come to pass, could not reach its fulfillment until the appointed time. We are the people of the appointed time. We are the people upon whom the end times have come. And they could not, without us, be made perfect. So the implication is all of these heroes of the faith, going all the way back to Abel, they've all been waiting for us to come along. It's up to us now to enter finally into the rest of God and thus bring them with us. It's almost as if we've been running a race. They're all in the stands watching us running, and they can only leave the stadium and go and celebrate the victory party when we finally cross the finish line. That brings us to the end of chapter 11 of the letter to the Hebrews. We'll have a look at chapter 12 next time. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining me. Goodbye.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World Podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.